Morning. Welcome to the Governance and Nominations Committee meeting. I'm Juanita James, the chair, and I would hereby like to call the meeting to order. And I'd like to ask the secretary to please call the roll.
Thank you. Committee Chair James.
Here.
Regent Bloom.
Here.
You're muted.
Regent Porth.
Here.
Committee Chair James, you have a quorum, and I'd like to welcome our guest, Dr. McTaggart, who's joining us from Washington, as well as our CSCU staff also in Washington. So thank you all for attending. Regent James, it's yours.
Thank you very much. As we continue our journey in stepping up this committee and hoping that it's going to be something of value added to the overall deliberations and strength of our Board of Regents. Thank you all for joining me this morning. And I'd like to, we have the agenda, and I think the first thing we do is we don't have a consent agenda. So do I need to call for any kind of an approval, Pam? Pam's gone.
Just as
We
an
can approve
adoption of the whole agenda, please.
Yes, so I'd like to call for a motion for the adoption of the agenda.
So moved. So moved.
Okay.
Second.
Thank you. The first action item is approval of the minutes of the February 18th special Governance and Nominations Committee meeting.
Move to approve the minutes.
May I have a second? Okay, we can't hear you, Rick, but I saw you visibly. I could see you say second, but I couldn't hear you.
I wasn't in attendance on February, so I can't.
Can you turn your volume up?
You're on mute according to the screen.
Okay, yeah. Regent Porth is
better?
That's better. Now, if you can just turn the volume up.
Sorry about that.
Okay.
I just wanted to say that I was not able to attend on February 18th, so I have to abstain on this vote.
Okay. Well, I guess Ira, then you and I need to approve. We do have a quorum.
Yes.
So, very good. Thank you. Okay. With the next agenda item is some work that we are beginning. I do not think we'll be able to conclude it today, but this is a discussion about the revision and updating of our current bylaws. We began to have this conversation in the last meeting in terms of making sure that we have the right committees, the committee names are correct, and we still have more work to do because as we began to look at the current bylaws, we realized that they were pretty much out of date. I guess there's been so much activity going on in the system and in our structure, in our committee structure. So with that, I'd actually like Karen first to lead this with what's the statutory authority around the bylaws so that we can have some clarification.
Certainly. So in the...
You need to turn up your volume, please.
One moment. Is that better?
A little bit.
A little bit. Okay, hang on. How about now?
That's much better. Thank you.
Okay. Sorry about that. So the statutory framework for the Board of Regents is contained in Chapter 10-A, and it starts with 10-A1. And it provides for the Board of Regents to adopt bylaws for the operation of the state university system. In that process, in 10A-6, the duties of the Board of Regents are laid out more specifically by statute. And again, this can be done one of two ways. You can indicate what is in statute already in your bylaws, or you can just refer to the statute because it sometimes changes with regard to its amendments by the General Assembly, and you can put something along the lines of, as from time to time amended. There are roughly 20 specific subsections which govern the work and the duties and responsibilities of the Board of Regents. And they do everything from undertaking such studies and other activities which will best serve the higher education interest for the Connecticut State University system. And they still call it the Regional Community Technical Colleges. That's being updated this year, and Charter Oak State Colleges. So that's sort of where it ends in terms of all other activities that are in the best interest. And it starts with, along the lines of that you have the authority to establish policies and guidelines for the CSCU system, Charter Oak and the community technical colleges, develop a master plan for higher education and post-secondary education, and to establish tuition and fees, and merge and close institutions within the system. So they're very broad duties and responsibilities that you have. And in terms of their reflection within the bylaws, again, you can do it one of two ways. You can do it as a reference to the statute, or you can list these things generally in the bylaws so that people looking at your operations don't have to go to two sources to determine what your roles and responsibilities are. And so the statutory authority for developing the bylaws, again, is by statute. And the bylaws that have been previously adopted talk about how you amend. You have made the decision as to how you amend those bylaws and what process you undertake in order to do that.
Okay, based on that, we know that these materials went out, fairly late this week, so you have not had time to really thoroughly review and digest all of the bylaws. Karen, I think it would be helpful if you could just give us the highlights of the items we have discussed to date, and as we have been working through this, the areas that we must update or pay attention to. Because it is not our intention to completely rewrite the bylaws of the Board of Regents. It is our intention to make sure that the bylaws accurately reflect the practices of where we are today. And so
let me just pull that document so that I have it in front of me as I go through this.
And if anyone has questions or comments, I'm watching the hand thing, so please go ahead and raise your hand if this particular agenda item, I am not expecting for us to resolve today, but I think it's an iterative series of discussions. It would be good for us to be able to have a formal recommendation once we agree as a committee, would like to present something to the board in either April or May before the end of this semester, so that we can start next semester with accurate documents reflecting the practices.
And Madam Chair, one of the things that I think may be helpful for the board members, and this would go along with the other items that we're discussing in terms of the onboarding materials. And having not been here long and not had a regent on board since I arrived, I'm still digging into all the information that's provided to you. But to have these statutes as they are updated also available to the regents, along with the bylaws, as part of a packet that they have to refer to for themselves as well, without having to call them up online. So in terms of walking through the what started out as the proposal to amend the bylaws for the last meeting, but also areas where I think that it needs to be updated. So starting with section 1, with regard to the authority of the Board of Regents, it does reference the 10A-1A, which is the creation of the Board of Regents for higher education as the governing body. And it also talks about the constituent unit. I think there are other items. It says the specific powers and duties of the board are prescribed in Title 10A. I think that the bylaws could reflect more specifically the specific authority that's in 10A6, which is, the things such as your ability to open and close campuses, to enter into contracts, to approve curriculum, so that is more thoroughly laid out here, as opposed to just a statutory reference to that authority. It helps, I think, the public who's looking at the bylaws on your website fully understand the authority that you have, as well as I think for anybody who keeps the single document with them versus, their statutes, to have that parcel of the authority of the Board of Regents and more robust in terms of understanding what those roles and responsibilities are and how you exercise. Any questions on this section?
Karen, I think that some of this work, in terms of a deeper understanding and awareness, can also in some ways be incorporated when we have a full board retreat and time, I think, to at least discuss whatever changes and updates we're trying to make and why.
Mm-hmm.
Because I don't think we have enough time to do it justice in the regular Board of Regents meeting, because we have so many other agenda items.
Mm-hmm.
But the highlights, I think, the things that we should, I'd like to come to recommendation is the committees and the committee structure,
Mm-hmm.
as well as you say, the overall definition. I think further discussion of what that means and what the implications are need a deeper discussion. But if we can at least get the names of the committees, the number of committees, right, so that we are working with a document that's current, that would be my goal. So what I would like is for, now if you could just go through pretty quickly some of those areas that we have discussed.
Absolutely. So board membership in section 2, again, that was changed to reflect the current statute in terms of who is on the Board of Regents. A year ago, it was changed to add the OPM secretary and their designee. So this update reflects that because the statute now reflects that. With regard to the training, the public, what I would recommend in section 4 is the Public Act be changed to the actual statutory reference. The bylaws have not been updated since 2022, so that was originally the Public Act at the time the board adopted these bylaws. Moving down to the officers of the board, we changed president to chancellor throughout to reflect, again, the statutory change to the head of the system being a chancellor. Right now, the officers of the board are listed as the chair, vice chair, the chancellor, and the secretary. I want to pin that for a moment, and because that will require further discussion. Going down to the duties of the officers, the chancellor has certain responsibilities by statute, so we've included those there in terms of his duties and responsibilities. It's a he currently, but the chancellor, whomever holds that position. So my reference to he is simply because that's who's currently sitting there. Then moving down to Article 3, which are the committees and representatives of the board. So the chairman and the board had made the decision to eliminate the executive and governance committee as it is constituted in the bylaws, which was the chair, the vice chair, and the standing committee chairs, and any additional members that the board appointed. As part of that committee, the chancellor was also, where it says CSCU system president, was an ex officio non-voting member of the executive and governance committee. So I think the first decision, so the committee that we are currently the committee whose meeting we are currently in, which is the Standing Committee of the Board for Governance and Nominations. The first question is, in terms of the what you want in the bylaws, in terms of the membership, is do you want the chancellor to be an ex officio non-voting member of governance and nominations, as the position was under executive and governance committee? So that is a point of discussion, I think, for this committee and to make a recommendation to the full board.
Yeah. And if anyone, Rick and there are certain things that as they come up, if we're already in agreement that that's something that we want, we can do that, so that, again, we're building this document, but we don't have to wait until we have every single point to at
Correct.
least get a sense of, this is something that we think is reasonable. I have also been on boards where the CEO or the president of the institution is an ex officio member of many committees,
Mhm.
but more frequently I see it the ex officio attached specifically to governance and nominations. So I think definitely for this committee, but we might want to have further consideration as to whether or not it is, we want to expand that. And Terry, this is one of those things where we'd want to get your thoughts in terms of what you see as best practices when we're in these systems, of the extent of which the participation of the chancellor is in the various board committees.
Okay, will do. And I think that would, perhaps depend on the committee.
Yeah.
Something like finance might make sense, and I will go through we're actually at the National Association of Higher Ed Systems annual conference, and so have access to a lot of their materials, and we'll look at ones that are, there was a lot of discussion about who are peer and aspirants as it relates to systems over these last couple of days, and there is not a good comparator necessarily to each system, but what I will look for is those that are closest to how our system operates with respect to both having 2- and 4-year institutions and the size of the institution. Terry, I think
and Karen, this is one where we would definitely want Terry's input as someone who has been advising us, who's an active long-term member of the Association of Governing Boards and is really quite familiar. So we would also be looking to get your input on that, Terry.
Real quick for the moment, realizing you're going to talk about this some more. I think there's a lot to be said for having him be an ex officio non-voting member of just about every committee, without the expectation that he or she shows up and participates, but that they'd be welcome. You don't need any special action to have them come and that kind of thing. And frankly, for more cohesiveness between the board and the chancellor.
Yeah. So again, this is not something for us. I'm starting to put things on the table that we need to think about and talk about.
absolutely.
Ira, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, there's another option in this, I think, which would be to make the appropriate vice chancellor the ex officio member of each committee. In other words, the vice chancellor for finance administration on the finance committee, the vice chancellor for academic affairs on the academic and student affairs committee, as representatives of the chancellor in this setting. And I think that's and presumably the chancellor through his cabinet would coordinate what is going on with his subordinates in this regard.
Can I just say, can you all hear me, first of all?
Yes.
Yeah.
Honestly, on this one, I agree with Terry. our official relationship, again, is only with the chancellor. And I think the chancellor should be ex officio member of every committee, but he should be free to designate who he would like to represent him, much like you were just saying, Ira, but it would be on his behalf or in his stead, participation in each of the committees. I honestly think it's important, for the reasons that Terry gave, that the chancellor know he's invited, he's part of every committee of the board, and especially this one, by the way. That's my feeling.
Well, we could have the chancellor or his designee.
That's
Right.
exactly where I was going to go, Ms.
Yeah,
Right.
that's good, Ira. I like that.
Bloom.
Okay. Keep going, Karen.
Certainly. So moving on to standing committees, which is section 1 of this article, you'll see that I have added the governance and nominations committee. We need to add here also the technology committee as a standing committee. Although I'm not 100, I'm still looking for, and Pam has been assisting on this in terms of what I found on the board's website when I initially joined was a IT committee that was a advisory committee. And so I don't know that a formal charter has been adopted, and so we need to dig into that a little bit more. But it was initially set up as an advisory committee to the board. It became permanent, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Pam, sometime in June of 23, under the chair of the prior board. Is that correct, Pam?
Correct.
And so that would need to be added along with its charge as adopted at the time. So academic and student affairs is correctly represented in terms of its title. Same with the audit committee. Finance, the language, they are now a finance and infrastructure committee. So that has been added to their title. And it needs to be their description. And the only reason I didn't change the descriptions is there were discussion as to whether or not we put the committee charters in the bylaws, or we simply leave their purpose and summary in the bylaws. And I know we had some discussion internally with regard to not having the charters in the bylaws, make it easier for the board or for the members of the committee to change that charter to reflect the current needs and work that they are doing, but understanding that it is still under the overall scope of that committee's mission. So I did not make any changes here with respect to the summaries for that very reason. So the governance and nominations committee has been added. I believe that this description reflects the committee's charge, but absolutely look for input on that. We've answered the question, at least preliminarily, with regard to the chancellor's being on the governance committee ex officio with that recommendation, or it appears to me to be consensus. If I'm wrong on that, please correct me. And then the human resource and administration committee, which is again reflective of the name. And then you'll see where it's highlighted in yellow, the need to add the technology committee or IT committee, whatever its official name is and responsibility. Committee membership.
Can I ask a dumb question?
There are no dumb questions, Rick.
This one, hang on. I know the technology. I know Ted's working hard with his committee on technology, and I know it's crucial to our future and to our success. I never saw a technology committee as an official part of a board's governance structure before. It existed in other places, but only as either an ad hoc or an advisory or a subcommittee to one of these standing committees we've been talking about. Am I wrong about that?
I think it's changing, Rick.
Okay,
I I have not seen it be an official committee of the board as opposed to a subcommittee of the finance committee in the
Yeah.
past. But in the boards that I'm on right now, there's discussion and there's even starting for the corporate boards, outside pressure from the investor relations people in the community to say we should have a separate cybersecurity committee or something along the cybersecurity and technology committee. So I agree with you. I don't think it's something we've seen in the past. I think it's something that's coming up more frequently right now.
okay,
But
that's reasonable. That's fine.
Terry, your
I would agree, and gosh, you know, the two new letters that control our lives, AI, speak to what you're saying, that the world has changed 20 years ago and maybe not so important, but.
Okay, good. So it makes sense to me.
Pam, you have your hand up.
Just
Yeah.
a little bit of context prior to the establishment of the technology committee. Cybersecurity was dealt with as an enterprise risk management issue and sat in the audit committee.
Hmm.
So, and that was, and then when Regent Yang came on board, its importance was elevated, and the necessity for a standalone technology committee with the improvement to their policies was also elevated. But that's where cybersecurity as the most important technology issue that we were dealing with 2 years ago. That's where it's at.
Okay, it all makes sense. I'm fine with that.
Thank you.
And I stand corrected. It was January of 24 that this came into existence, not June of 23, I believe.
We probably were in discussions as far back as June of 23, but there you go.
And Jessica just found for me a draft of the committee charter for technology, so it's unclear to me whether or not that was ever adopted, and we'll have to hunt that down. But it has a broadly defined, or its purpose is it's more task oriented rather than, its general purpose is to be responsible for the oversight of technology infrastructure, cybersecurity measures, and strategic integration of technology across the CSCU. It focuses on ensuring robust, secure, and innovative technological environments across the system. So that sounds to be a little more hands-on than typically the committees are phrased at, and I don't know if that's why it's still a draft, but we can pin that a little bit, and I can work on the its general purpose and scope with the committee members and find out, where they are with that.
Yes. So Pam, I'm going to ask you to keep track of these things because what I'm hoping for from this meeting is we have a list of questions of things that we want to mull over so that we can either bring them to conclusion at our next GNC meeting. And that's why you could see why I took this agenda item off the Board of Regents agenda for the last meeting, because we are nowhere near ready to make final recommendations to the board in terms of the bylaw revisions.
Right.
So if we can just
I'm
keep
tracking
track of the questions that we're raising, because once we've gotten through them, then, and you have time to reflect on them, we might have a few, like informal planning meetings in between, like to see where we come out. One of the other practices I have seen in boards, though, is that while the committee, why the committee does exist in the bylaws, the charters don't. And it is the chairs of the committees who actually make the recommendations to the charter and then present them to the governance committee and for approval to the board, as opposed to having us draft the charters for each committee. So that's another way of doing this, and actually having the committee chairs review and update their committee charters with their committees. Again, that's just food for thought.
And if we do want to move the committee chairs and grant them the responsibility to make those reviews, we might need to tweak the wording in the Governance and Nominations Committee charter, which discusses the review and updating of committee charters.
It could be the review and approval.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
just want to make sure that the language matches and
Right.
I think we have to have an approval. I mean, one of the committee chairs could go wild, and I think we need. I think the governance nominate. I think the committee has to review the proposed, wherever they come from. I think it has to review the proposed.
Oh,
committee
I agree that we need to approve. I think we're looking for the balance between what's the oversight responsibility of this committee without diminishing the role of the chairs of the different committees. So it's,
Yeah.
as we
Yeah.
go through this, hitting that right balance is, and tweakable, by the way, over time. So none of this, again, is cast in stone, but
right.
I have
So-
another question, if I may. The executive committee, as you remember, had the authority to act for the board in emergencies when the board was, between board meetings. I think we need to put that somewhere. If some catastrophe occurs and we can't convene the full board, what subgroup would be empowered to, if we have a student takeover of a bill, all kinds of things can happen these days that have happened in the past.
yeah, I think that's a good question. I don't think it's a role for the governance committee, but I do think we should have some protocol practice
Yeah,
in that event and figure out who that body of decision makers are.
yeah, but that's what I think. Yeah, I don't know
Yeah.
where it would fall necessarily, but I think we have to have it.
Mhm. Would it make sense
The other thing,
for,
I'm sorry.
for thought processes, would it make sense to have it be the board chair, the vice chair, and then an appropriate chair of a standing committee, depending on what the issue is? Let's say we had something like the we had the worldwide outage of the internet this past fall that impacted a lot of systems. And if there was something that the board needed to do other than your normal emergency management committee, you would need, the chair of the technology committee to be involved in that, and perhaps finance. But anyway,
Yeah,
that's
and things like student protests,
Yeah,
the head of the HR committee should be involved in that. So
Mhm. All right, I can certainly draft something that addresses emergency circumstances and look at how other organizations populate that sort of subcommittee, if that is the desire to have that function be reflected in the bylaws.
I'm glad Ira brought this up. I agree that we need something like that. My 2 cents, that it be more than 3 people and that it not rotate, that it be the same group of people, however it's comprised. And it should include at least the officers, the board, the region officers of the board. That's my 2 cents.
the other thing that I think we're missing in this, we don't have a deputy chancellor. So if the chancellor is not available for whatever reason, we don't have an officer who would be designated to be the head of the system. I mean, normally you have in a system like this, there is normally a designated second in command. And, you know, we don't have a title, you know, I mean, it could be anything, but if Terrence has gone off on vacation in Mongolia and is not available, who is the senior staff person?
It's a good question. Terry, I'm putting that one at your feet too, in terms of,
It
can
is,
you give us some examples or ideas in terms of that provision?
I was right, without a deputy vice chancellor, well, you've got vice chancellors. I think just naming somebody, the logical ones would be chief of staff or CFO. Probably in this instance. On the other hand, Karen, I'm sure would serve very well also with her background. So I think you just have to decide in consultation probably with Terrence.
Okay.
The position of the chief financial officer has been recently revamped to be an executive vice chancellor for that purpose, but it's not reflected in the bylaws currently.
Okay, so it should be.
Mhm.
Another wrinkle on this one is in any given situation, I know of situations where the chancellor would say, okay, I'm going to be in, God knows where for a month or whatever. And I'm designating so-and-so in my place because there are times when just by personality and experience, the CFO might not be the right person, but the general counsel might be, or the chief academic person might be. So that's another option, is to have the chancellor have when they're going to be gone for, or when they're, going to be gone for some period of time or without communication. Then you have the issue, of course, if they get sick in a hurry, then that's where it's good to have one that's standing by. So as you say, Madam Chair, this can take some noodling before you come
Yes.
down on it.
Okay. So with the agreement of the group, I would like to now sort of understand that this is a continuing agenda item in discussion. I would like to move on to some of our other agenda items, particularly the ones that I'm hoping we get some resolution today to prepare some, recommendations to the Board of Regents. If there's anything particularly urgent that we'd like to see, saying, that's off the table, let's keep moving. So I'm not going to go in order. Yes, Karen.
Just quickly, I think it makes sense, as we have consensus on some items, for me to make edits or recommend language to this and share it, the iterations of it, as they become available, if that works for the committee.
That absolutely does. I think that's how we move forward. So based on the conversation and sort of consensus, or where people's sensibility is, I think the next time we look at this should reflect that, knowing that, again, we're not going to get it all done in one setting, but I also don't want us to keep revisiting the topics where we clearly already have established some agreement. Fair enough? Okay.
Yes.
The next item on the agenda is board participation. This was in the two searches. There was an urgency for this because of where we stand right now in the search for both Western and Southern. The larger context, which I want to continue that discussion, is we were beginning to have conversations about which role, what is the Regent's role and participation and relationship with certain senior executive positions. We're not going to try to resolve that one today. I want us to keep it in the back of our mind, because that is something that I'd like to dig into deeper in our next GNC meeting or executive session. Because there are many schools of thought. What's our involvement with the presidents at the institutions? Which system office staff people should we have more of a direct connection to? And I know this is something that I believe, Terry, is even on the agenda for the board retreat. So I want you to know that whatever we decide for this, it's not to preempt that or to say that that particular question has been resolved. And we've had some back and forth on this one in terms of should regents be involved in the first round or the second round or just the final round? And right now we have candidates, I think, semifinalist candidates for Western, and we're getting asked who's going to interview the candidates. And the initial thought for Western is the chair, the vice chair, the chair of the HR committee, and I also recommended the chair of the academic affairs committee because that the presidents of the institutions and the provost, those are the entities that are always on the agenda for the ASA committee. Always. If it were, let's say the chief financial officer, I would expect, and I think the chair of the finance committee was very much involved in those interviews, or some of the regents were, or was he not, Pam? On the search committee
The
for
chair
the
of the finance committee was invited and opted not to participate.
Oh, okay, but
Other
normally-
members of that committee did.
okay. So that's sort of my thinking, but it's a whole spectrum of things on this one. So I think part of it is we really need to give Pam an answer as to who of the regents or how many regents should be involved in the interview process and at what stage. And the initial thought was only at the finalist round. But then we kind of went back and said, I don't know, maybe we should see more than just one or two people. Maybe we should be involved at the semifinalist round. So this, I really want to hear from you what your thinking is. And when I say hear from you, I mean all of you, include and Terry, jump in on this one too, because it is that balancing act between oversight and exercising our fiduciary responsibility, or getting a little too deep into the weeds. Which board members tend to do. So,
If I could, let me just frame it up real quick in terms of practice elsewhere.
yeah,
And it runs the gamut between deep involvement where a board member will chair the committee, the search committee in the first place, and be around through the whole process, or co-chair, perhaps with a faculty member. I'm thinking of presidential searches rather than senior staff at the moment. Then there's the middle ground, which seems to be where you are now. The semifinalists and a select number of board members sit in and provide their take to the appointing authority. And then there's the question of whether the chancellor is the decider, the chancellor in consultation with the board, or in many cases, the boards hire the president, even though they report to the system head. And in really large systems, the board may not see the finalist or anybody else. So you seem to be tending toward that middle ground, even though I realize this is kind of an ad hoc decision because of the two current insertions. But a small number of trustees interviewing the semifinalists and sharing with the chancellor or his designee their take on their strengths and weaknesses of the candidate.
I come out of a background where these kinds of hiring decisions are only made by the CEO. But higher ed may be different, and I'm listening carefully to you, Terry, and to everyone else on this call. But what you just said, Terry, runs the whole gamut of involvement. And here's a thought, just to try to keep us thinking on this, would it be appropriate to have some at least advisory role in hiring the presidents of each individual college or university, but allowing the chancellor to have the entire say on senior staff? Just a thought.
Apropos of that earlier discussion, the item that I brought out about having senior staff possibly be ex officio members of the relevant committee, that would seem to say that there should be a bit more board involvement with the senior staff. Still advisory, I would recommend, Rick, but with the senior staff as well. Is the finance committee confident in the applicants to be the CFO? Well, we wouldn't want to leave them in the dark, I don't think.
In CUNY, we had a kind of interesting mixture of these things. The search committee was chaired by a board member, which I'm not sure is the ideal situation. And there was a senior staff person assigned to that board member and that search, who participated and worked closely with the board member, a chair who was chairing that search. The committee, at the end of the process, the committee was expected to come up between 3 and 4 finalists, and they would go through the kind of process we have of being tortured by everybody at the campus, that and if they survived that, which is a good test of how they would do actually as president. In the end, the chancellor made the decision of which of the finalists to pick. But there was input from a number of different constituencies along the way. So I don't. My own view is because the board member we had a larger board, and we had a few board members, as every board has, who were a little questionable for a variety of different reasons. But I think the idea of my own view is I don't think a board member should chair the committee. I do think that the board member of some group of board members should interview the final 3 or 4 candidates and give their advice to the chancellor. And I assume, that the chancellor, I mean, if the chancellor heard from the board members, from all the board members saying, we think this candidate is a terrible candidate, I would assume the chancellor wouldn't pick that candidate. But okay, but that's, but I think that that process, I like the idea of what we've been having a president chair of the committee. Obviously a different, a president from. We only have 6 institutions. So this is CUNY had, depending on how you counted, 21, 22, 23. Because we had the law school, the medical school, and a few other odd pieces that had had heads that for whom there were search committees in addition to the presidents. But I think the board needs to have an interview with, I think, more than 2. I mean, but somewhere between 2 and 4 of the final candidates, however we get to that stage. I mean, I would hope that the process, if you had the semifinal group, would be that the search would be somewhere around 10 or 12, and that would be brought down to about 3 or thereabouts finalists. And then that leaves a real choice, but not an overwhelming, not an overwhelming choice. And at the end of the process, the chancellor selects.
Yeah, and Rick, I've had both experiences. I have been on boards, both academic and corporate, where when I was chair of the HR and Com committee, I was involved in the search and the interview process for the chief human resources officer that came in. When I chaired the governance and nominating committee, I was on the search committee for the general counsel position, in addition to the chair and the vice chair of the board. But I've also been in institutions where we really only got involved with the CEO interviewing and all of the CEO's direct reports. You know, we were introduced to them, but we weren't part of the
Right.
influential process. So I think it is a little bit all over the place. It's all over, it runs the gamut. And so for us, it's really how do we think about what we think is best for the CSCU system at this particular point in time. And I do think that because we've had some real challenges and turnover with the presidents of various institutions over the last several years, I would, for this one, want to see more involvement in the process rather than after the fact. So I'm kind of in Ira's, court about we should probably see 2 to 4 candidates. You said more than 2. I'm happy with 2, but so that we can offer our points of view in terms of where we think that candidates' strengths are and provide our input. And Terrence has been really good about calling to say, so what did you think? What did you think? So it's not as though he has been at all resistant to having input from the regents on some of the searches that have happened recently.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Both you and Ira. Yeah.
So do we have is this one where we can turn around and say, Pam, this is what we want to do?
And it's
Especially
done.
since you're scheduling interviews next week and the week after.
It's done.
Okay.
All of the interviews with the 4 semifinalist candidates for Western have been added. There's a block of time added to Marty's calendar, yours, Juanita, Ira, yours, as well as Sophia's. So the 4 members that you mentioned will have an opportunity to meet all of the semifinalists, and then every region will be invited to meet the final 2 candidates sometime during their open forum periods. So we haven't gotten to that phase yet, but next week from the 11th through the 14th is when the semifinalists will be on campus at Western.
Okay.
So
And is it anticipated the same thing will be true for Southern?
Yes, Southern's application deadline is not until March 14th. So they are running about 3 to 4 weeks behind Western. But the same process, unless something changes between now and then in terms of how you want presidential searches to change, the process to change that has been documented since January, that will be the same process at Southern.
Is it accurate to say that what Pam just described for both places is consistent with what we seem to have coalesced around in this discussion?
I dropped into the chat also for your benefit the current search process steps for CSCU presidents.
It feels to me like it is, Rick, and it's also the kind of middle ground in that gamut where there's some significant board involvement, but not all the way from the very beginning.
Yeah. So Juanita, are you
I'm fine with
comfortable
it.
with what?
I don't see the chat function on my thing though.
Down in the lower right-hand corner with a little like balloon bubble. At least that's where it is on my screen.
I can send it out to the committee
Oh, no,
members.
I see it.
Okay.
Oh,
There was
yeah,
something-
yeah,
There was
yeah.
something blocking it. Okay.
Did,
Right. But that does sound
who-
consistent with what we've been thinking about.
That's good. It sounds like
Yeah.
we're in a good place then.
Okay. So can we, that one is one that we can say when we report out or when you report out, is that one that we're ready to report out to the board at the February 27th meeting?
March 27th.
Oh, sorry, March 27th.
Yes.
I think so, right?
Okay.
yes, I would, let me get back in. I was just looking at the doc. Yes, I would think so too.
Okay.
Who is chairing the Southern Search?
It is co-chaired with Jess Kraus from Southern and President Maduko.
And who are the co-chairs of the Western Search?
Just one chair, Zulma Toro,
Okay.
but there for each search committee and search advisory committee, there are 39 members for each of those combined committees. So with huge representation from the campuses.
Yeah.
So
No, I know those advisory committees.
Yeah. And I understand, Terry, that you worked with us on this search process with Lori Lamb. Is that correct?
The prior HR director, yeah, this is a good enough place to be. Just a quick piece of gratuitous advice, a successful search is getting the right person for the job. And if as a result of these conversations, you have serious doubts, better to postpone the decision when you get there, right? And, counsel Terrence in that regard, than to take the last woman or man standing.
I would second that. My experience
Absolutely.
with that situation has been a disaster when you pick the last person standing. People, we canceled searches in my former life, even though it produced a lot of unhappiness, because it's a long process with a lot of people, with 39 people or whatever getting. But picking the wrong candidate causes a lot more problems in the end.
and I
Absolutely.
truly believe that President Toro will not compromise.
I agree with you that. And I actually served on the search advisory committee for the chancellor. There were 56 of us on that committee.
Can I make one further suggestion on connection? I think there should be a chair of each committee, not co-chairs. I think somebody should have the responsibility.
Jessica, you want to chime in on why we have co-chairs at Southern?
Sorry about that.
Oop.
I got it. All right, we good?
Yep.
So the reason for the co-chair because that's only happening for Southern. That's not something that typically happens. That is an anomaly. It was actually requested by the University Senate that they wanted kind of a co-chair model, but we also wanted to have a current institution president sit as, obviously within that leadership capacity. So that was a little bit of a, negotiation with the Senate, but, completely open to agreement and wanted to kind of collaborate with the institution, especially given some of the challenges that we had with other searches, just to make sure that everybody felt that their voice was being heard.
Okay. If we can move on to the next agenda item, this one should be easy. We have all seen the Regent onboarding recommendation. There was one comment in terms of dividing it into 2 days versus one, so the proposal has been modified to reflect that. That is one that I hope we can also push forward. And Karen, you didn't have an onboarding, but neither did I. And I don't know how many people did, but it's been a while since we've had any kind of an onboarding process for either senior staff or regents. So that's why I think We should establish one now. We can always make it better, but we should at least have one. So,
The other thing I think we should have an onboarding process for the presidents.
I agree.
Because it's
We,
I started that at CUNY because our past practice, the president was selected. Here's the key to your official car. If you're the president of Queens College, take the Long Island Expressway, make a left turn at Casino Boulevard, and you'll be at the campus, and good luck. That never seemed to be a reasonable approach to the world.
and we have done that for our recent presidential appointments. Jessica has done all of the coordination with senior staff and the rotation, and they come in for a day and a half, or whatever it takes. And Karim Ismaili from Eastern went through a full onboarding here at the system office, including work with me in terms of how the board functions and where presidents can find board information and those kinds of things. So I think we've got that one handled for at least these next two appointments that will follow the model that Jessica has put into place.
No, I think Pam captured it. It was kind of a joint effort, I would say. Terry, I believe that you kind of also weighed in on that a little bit with Lori as we were kind of working through how exactly to acclimate new institution leaders to the system. And it was a full day, I have to admit. President Ismaili, it was a marathon of a day for him, but I think he did well. And he was able to kind of get an understanding of the system. And I think we could, obviously you can always improve, but I think it's a good start versus, not having anything really, consistent historically.
That has become a consistent practice across the country. There's a literature on it. Board professionals get smart about how to do it, often scheduled to last over 6 months or longer. Not just where they fit in the administration, but the things that aren't written down, the politics of the system, the politics of the state if they're from away, all of those things. Jessica, you're absolutely right.
I mean, they should know what the tank traps are before they
the minefields. Yeah.
Minefields, yeah.
Okay.
Before they step in them. Yeah.
Yeah. I realize I skipped one of the items that I really would like for us to move forward with at the March meeting. And I'm going to have to turn this also over to Karen in terms of what are the conditions for an executive session. But we did speak about making a standing practice at the end of every Board of Regents meeting, an executive session, so that we have that opportunity just to have a conversation together as a board, because there's very little just interboard reaction in the system, and the way the process, the way we've designed it. But then there were some very specific things about what are the reasons that we have legitimately to go into executive session. So if you can, Karen, if you and Pam have trying to figure out how to get us to that point, because it's something we want to do. We just want to do it without violating any protocols or bylaws or statutes, or so if you would.
Yeah, certainly. So I provided, and I'm sure that you have not had the opportunity to look at them, but I provided the statutes that govern executive session, both from definitions, what is covered by executive session, and the sort of rules for executive session with respect to who can be in executive session at a particular time. The question was asked at the last board meeting whether or not the board could meet by itself without anybody else present in the executive session, and the answer is yes. because other people in the executive session are there specifically for the purpose to provide the board information on an item that is pertinent to the executive session. So with respect to that, these are the primary ones. You are looking at documents that are otherwise not public and having to discuss those documents. If those documents are in draft, you can go into executive session to discuss those documents. You can go into executive session to discuss a personnel matter, although you normally have to give the individual who is the subject of that executive session the opportunity to be aware of that. And it has to be for the specific reason of appointment, termination, performance with regard to a particular individual, and that individual has the right to request that the meeting be held in open session. In the 30 years that I've been doing this in the public sector, and I've only ever seen one individual who asked that their meeting be held in public session when they were discussing the individual's performance and the possibility that it might lead to a termination. With respect to that, and in one of the statutes, and I can provide it, there is a law, and I provided some of them, the ones most pertinent to the board, in terms of what are the exemptions under FOI that you can go into executive session, because whatever the subject matter is already exempt from disclosure. And usually those are documents. With respect to, I've gone through a number of decisions over the past couple of weeks with respect to each of these things, and I can tell you that most of them, the FOI, should we ever get a complaint, will read the statute more strictly. I came across one decision which they talked about a pending claim or pending litigation, and the lawyer was invited into executive session, and the FOI commission determined that the lawyer should have left the executive session at the point that they were no longer being asked questions and the board just wanted to discuss it. So they read it very, very strictly when a complaint is brought. And so we need to be mindful of that. And when any time that we are going into executive session, we need to have a very specific list of invitees. That list of invitees needs to be reflected in our minutes. And they must be contributing to the information the board needs in order to discuss whatever the item is that they went into executive session for. With regard to the issue of the board sort of talking about its relationships within the board itself, there are times when you can meet. So if you're meeting just by chance or for a social function, not an issue. If you have a quorum, in other words, and I'm trying to say this in a succinct way so that I'm clear. If you had an executive session on the board agenda because you needed to discuss the draft collective bargaining agreement, and you're not going to take any votes, that's perfectly legitimate to be an executive session. You can end that executive session. You can then end the board meeting. But that doesn't mean you can't go into another room and say, hey, I want to talk about how you handled, or how you spoke to me in such and such a meeting, and, want to talk about the decorum. And I find that we're not, holding to protocol, and we're talking over each other, and we need to get that straight. You're not making any decisions. You're not talking about any issues that require you to make any decisions. And I don't think that either constitutes a meeting, even though you have a quorum present, because you're not conducting any business, and that you are on relatively safe ground. But it has to be very, very clear that those meetings with the board just among itself are not to discuss what would be something that the board is responsible for as part of their duties and responsibilities, nor as part of a action that may be coming down in the future.
Okay, so The other thing that you didn't mention is when we go into executive session, it's all regions, including the non-voting regions. We can't just have executive session with the voting regions. Is that correct?
That is correct. Well, let's put it this way. They could complain if you excluded them. Again, under your rules, the faculty advisory committee members are not automatically part of any executive session. They have to be specifically invited in. The ex officio non-voting members are still defined by statute as members of the Board of Regents, and they have the full right to debate and to discuss matters in front of the Board of Regents, even if they don't ultimately get to vote on those matters. So those same rules apply to executive session as they do to the regular meeting.
So we are going to institute a practice that after the board meeting, we have an opportunity to have, and do we call it executive session, or how do we just put it on the agenda?
I'm not sure that you need to have it on the agenda if, again, it's about board relations and how you are operating with each other,
Okay,
because you're not making any decisions. Now, if you were to, as part of these bylaws, in there it says board members are expected to regularly attend meetings. That's one of their obligations. If you down the road want to put in a standard for participation of board members, that if they miss 3 meetings in a row or so many in a year, that the board can discuss requesting that they be removed from the board, and you're going to reach out to their appointing authority. That is something that as a body you're really making a decision on, and I would say that would be appropriate for executive session.
At the conclusion of the meeting, what you're saying, if the meeting ends, right, and the meeting is adjourned,
Correct.
and we go next door to lunch for lunch,
Correct.
okay, and we're free to yell at each other in that room about whatever we want to yell at each other about, as long as it's not a pending item on the agenda or separate.
Yeah, or even something, because you have that one meeting reconsideration option, I would caution that you can't, if we were on the board together, Ira, and I voted against something that you thought was a dumb idea, and you went at me and said, I think this is stupid, you made the thing fail, and blah, 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 and whatever you did then caused me to go to the next meeting and say, I'd like to move to reconsider because I was on the prevailing side and I'd like to change my vote. That would be, I think, inappropriate.
If I called you on the telephone and said that to you.
And it was just you and I, different. Not everybody else is in the room there, and you could be changing the minds of everybody else in the room.
Just for clarification, Karen, can the board have a regularly scheduled session in confidence, an executive session at the end of every meeting, in which the chair says to the members, how are we doing with the president, or excuse me, with the chancellor and the presidents? Anything we need to talk about? And as an early warning thing, or is that not okay?
I would say that's not okay because you're discussing the performance of an employee of the board, and that would require an executive. That is something that would occur in executive session.
Okay, what if, and presumably they need to know about it, right?
Presumably, yes.
What about if on hiring presidents and chancellors, the board said, let it be understood that at the end of every meeting, we're going to have this kind of confidential, no decisions, off the record conversation, just so that we can identify problems before they become crises. Do you agree to that?
I'm not sure what you mean by identify problems before they become crises. Again, if it's something that the board has the authority to make decisions about, then you are discussing an issue that relates to board business in and not declaring it an executive session and not letting people know what you're talking about because you're saying off the record and whatever else. Executive session by its very nature is off the record. And so unless it falls into those categories that are under the statute, you cannot meet to discuss problems before they become problems in executive session.
What if it's under the heading of personnel matters?
Same thing. It would need to be an executive session.
No problem with that, right?
Correct.
That's what they're for. Yeah.
But you
So it
have
sounds
to,
like
but
you-
you have to, if it's about a specific individual or a group of specific individuals.
You have to announce it
Correct.
as an executive session. I think the only safe thing that we can do if the board wants to get together and have, the only thing we can do is have lunch and talk about each other's families and kids and where we're going on vacation and you know, whether you're going to miss a board meeting. That I think is acceptable non-executive session behavior post-meeting. Everything else will have a purpose, a statement, who's invited, and no votes are taken in executive session.
I think it's slightly broader than that, Pam, as I said, you know, in terms of
Be safe.
talking about the relationship between the board members in terms of how they operate as a body. You can meet, the board members can meet to discuss the agenda and items that should be on the agenda. In other words, the creation of the agenda without running afoul of FOI. But because you're not making any decisions about the business, you're not talking about the business itself, you're talking about whether or not it should be on or off an agenda.
Yeah, so my question, and I want to make sure that I've got this clear, was we can't upfront just state that every meeting we're going to have an executive session.
Yes.
In other words, when we're going to have an executive session, we have to announce that we're having an executive session and go through the language about we're not going to take any votes or whatever, but we have to basically, in other words, we were trying to make this like a matter of course, as opposed to something that raises red flags because people are concerned that we're having some big, important conversation, either about collective bargaining or individuals, and if they're not included, so it was a way to just establish that we'll have a protocol as a regular part of our meeting, that there'll be some time for us to talk. And what I'm hearing you say is you can't kind of just do that as a blanket thing.
Well, we have for the past 6 months included the statement at the end of, it might even be longer, Jessica, that we've included executive session anticipated as the last agenda item on every board meeting. And then Chair Gray would say, not necessary to have an executive session. There's no particular purpose that would demand us to have an executive session. However, you guys can go and have lunch after every single board meeting and talk about how you can be better regents without making that announcement.
Karen, what about the idea we talked about putting an item at the end of the agenda called good and welfare? If there's a basis for going into executive session, there can be a motion. If there's not, and somebody wants to say something in public about something, they can do it.
Can I just say, Karen, I just want to back up what Ira said. I'll promise I'll make this quick. I had one complaint filed against me. I ended up at a Freedom of Information Commission hearing years ago. They're very serious about their jobs, just like you say. It's not an easy process to go through. And ever since then, if I'm honest, I've been leery about promoting executive sessions without following the letter of the law. But what Ira just suggested, putting in an item on the agenda regularly, where you can go around the table and people can say what they're thinking on a variety of different issues, not an executive session. And there we would depend on the discretion of board members. that might be a way for us to finally have an opportunity to communicate with each other in a way we haven't had before. That's my 2 cents on that. I think
Yeah, so-
Ira might be onto
So
something.
Rick, I kind of like Pam's suggestion better, which is we put the agenda, executive session anticipated. If we don't need it, we don't need it. I would not feel comfortable going around the table in open session and just sort of say, well, this is how I feel it went. And the only reason I say that is that you have to realize that anything and everything can be taken out of context. Everything can be 30-second sound bites. And you might be having a conversation, and then if you take a snippet out of it, it presents a
I
totally
understand. I
different
hear you.
picture.
Yep.
So for example, all of these horrible news articles that we hear, if we want to challenge, because I'm always yelling and screaming, why don't, technically speaking, they might be factual, but they leave out context and they leave out a whole, in other words, they paint a completely different picture of what's going on, but tell just enough of the half truth
Yeah, I
to not be
understand.
able to be challenged. And and I think people don't want to speak out for that reason, because they know, unfortunately, we have people sitting in the room that are looking to find any little thing you say and do a gotcha with it.
I hard to argue with that. I guess I don't know the answer. We need an opportunity to talk more with each other sort of outside of the formal board agenda business. But I respect what you just said. I am concerned about always going or often going into executive sessions. That also
Yeah.
creates a bad feeling among the rest of the folks out there.
And,
So
there are other organizations who do put executive session anticipated on there. And then if there isn't anything at the start of the meeting, the board chair would say, we do not have any items for executive session today. But so you're either doing one of two things. You're either voting, if something comes up after the agenda has been published, you're then voting to add it to the agenda and then, having to vote to go into executive session versus providing context in the meeting as to the reason why you're going into executive session so that the public is appropriately informed. Now, usually you'll know that at least 24 hours in advance, but there are some things that have been happening, of late that I would say it might not be, an EO comes out of Washington on the morning of one of your board meetings,
Yeah.
and we
Yeah.
might need to say, we need to talk to you in executive session. About what's going on with this, and the lawsuits are coming fast and furious at the AG levels, and whether or not we are tasked to be a party to one of those, and need input from the board at the last minute for what will be a pending litigation. And again, I think you can talk among each other about how you felt the board meeting went, which is a procedural matter. It's not decision. I felt that we spent too much time on one issue and we didn't move and maybe it's for feedback for the chair. I don't think you shepherded that conversation very well, and we lost a lot of time. And can we run the meetings a little tighter? Those kinds of conversations are not about items that you're required to act on or that affect the system. It affects how the board meeting is run and how you are all operating together as a body. So could that be an issue of public concern? Only if you're really going sideways, in which case then I'd recommend you do it in executive session because it then becomes more of a personnel matter, but a personnel matter for the board members themselves versus one of the people who work for you, because we all support the system that you govern.
So we're going to have to abandon the other two agenda items, and I really need to adjourn this meeting. Let me get a sense of where do we stand on this one? We need further discussion. We're going to we're going to probably say executive session anticipated at the March 27th board meeting and leave it at that without trying to make it anticipated at every single meeting?
Juanita, I trust your judgment on this. I hear what you're saying. I'm content to do it either way. Either justice next time or express our intention to do this in the coming months with some sort of announcement during the meeting, whether it's actually going to happen or not. I could go either way.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that the reason we were trying to get this short term is a big part of this executive session intention is for us to do
Yeah.
better and be more
Yeah.
effective as a board in
Yes.
terms of our interactions and the meetings and making them.
Yes.
So a lot of it is much more around how effective are we being as board members? I don't think those are conversations we want to have with everybody else in the room. You know?
No.
Because then,
No,
I hear
because
you.
if we did, we, you know, then I'd be very hesitant if I thought a particular regent was, you know, off the deep end or something I'd be very hesitant to say that if, you know, we're on camera, on screen, et cetera, and so forth. Because then, you know, I can see it coming back that, you know, you embarrassed me in front of my colleagues or something along those lines, you know,
Right.
that kind of thing.
Maybe
you're
we
right.
should try to just keep the practice of having lunch at the next room afterwards. And
I think we continue the practice that we have informally established to include on every single agenda, executive session anticipated. And then it's easier to take it off the agenda by a simple announcement than get 2/3 of a vote to put, 2/3 vote, a majority vote to get an
To put
agenda
it on
item
the,
added.
yeah.
yeah,
And then always have lunch or some social event where you guys can talk amongst yourselves, where no board business is discussed immediately after executive session or the gaveling out of a meeting. Just make that standard protocol.
Because frankly, you know, at every organization I've ever worked for, and this is just sort of informal, the business has to be conducted in public unless it falls into one of those categories. And
Right.
the board talking about how they're interacting with each other has never been, to my understanding, a board business matter.
Mhm.
Me either. Correct. Yeah, that's everything I've seen follows that methodology.
so if we have an apple in each lunchbox, we can throw it at the board member we're angry at in the meeting. So maybe we should include that in the lunch.
Well,
Terry, you have anything more to say right now, or?
No.
So I would go with, let's just put in anticipated and take it off the agenda if we don't need
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
And see how that goes. And if that starts to create a different set of challenges, then we have to come back and have this conversation again.
It makes sense, Juanita. I agree with you.
I agree. I agree.
Yeah. Okay, I'm sorry we didn't get to the other two items. I didn't think we were going to get to all 11 of them in 90 minutes, but very much appreciate this discussion, your thoughtfulness, and we have more thinking to do so that we can come to the next meeting saying, okay, we threw a lot of things out here. I feel good about this. Let's move forward on that. Because the whole point is for us to get to a level of alignment in terms of how we feel we can better serve the institution with a more effective governance model and practices. Okay.
Yep.
All right. More to come.
Okay.
Thanks, Juanita. Good discussion.
I'll take, can I
you.
have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
So moved.
Second.
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 All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you all very much.
Thank
Have a
you,
good
Madam
weekend,
Chair.
guys.
Goodbye, everybody.
care.
Have a great weekend.
care.
Bye,
Aye.
Terry.
Terry,
Thanks for
take care.
joining us.
Your live stream is stopped.